the captions or whatever, the memes. It can't stop me because it's a vision that I have and it's goals that I have that I set out for myself that I got to get there no matter what.
What's up, y'all? Welcome back to my channel. As you know, my name is Tiffany, and we are on chapter 3 of the true story of the Baltimore City Jail, aka BCDC. If this is your first time checking into this story time, go back about 2 videos and start at the beginning. That'll give you a lot of information that you might be seeking just about the book, or you know, where I got it from, why I'm reading it, and things like that. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into chapter 3. I guess I should put a disclaimer in here. This is going to be some very, very raw, graphic content. It's not for kids. It's not for anybody with a weak stomach. It's not for anybody that don't want to hear about any, I don't even know. I can't even imagine what's in this book. I can't even imagine. So I can't even warn you. Okay? If that sounds like something that you might not want to hear about, all types of crazy, disgusting, corrupt, scandalous things that go on behind the prison walls, this is your time to exit out, because I'm not sugarcoating. I'm going to read the book just how he wrote it. So there's the disclaimer. 1993. Now that the cloud of doom was from over my head, I moved into an apartment on Sinclair Lane. I told myself that I wasn't going to hack anymore and started to look for a so-called real job. A week later, I had officially lied to myself. I was back in the business of hacking, doing what I did best, making money. What doesn't kill you truly makes you stronger. I had so many close calls, but I survived. I had accumulated so many clients that I transported back and forth to work. I didn't have time to pick up anybody off the streets. The women even trusted me to pick up their children from various destinations. I was so proud of my entrepreneurial skills that I contemplated getting a fleet of cars and going legit. I was humbled by the opportunity of a second chance and was pushing my mind and body to the full limit of exhaustion. One day, in the heart of winter, I had driven myself so hard that my immune system had all but totally collapsed. I had fallen victim to one of the worst colds I had ever had. I could not get out of bed, much less go hacking. I explained to my clients that I had to take a few days off so my body could rest. I had no health insurance, so I couldn't call a primary care doctor. Plus, when I didn't work, I didn't get paid. Just because my body decided to take a break didn't mean the bills stopped coming. I had to crawl out of bed whether I had pneumonia or not and will my body through the sickness. For the most part, hacking had been good to me. I began to ask myself, is this what I wanted to do for the rest of my life? Although I was a people's person, I didn't envision chauffeuring as a career. It was only out of necessity. I thought about what else I could do. All I had was a GED and an honorable discharge from the Army. It seemed like nobody was hiring at the time. Going back to school was out of the question. Nobody was going to take care of a grown-ass man with children while he pursued a higher education. The thought of breaking the law never crossed my mind. My experience with the judicial system had scared me straight. Then the craziest thought popped into my head. I didn't have any kind of record. Maybe I could apply to be a correctional officer. The correctional officers I gave rides to didn't look any tougher than me. Shit, if they could handle it, I knew I could. Plus, I heard the money was off the hook. I know I can handle it, I told myself. I always wanted to run my own business, but the truth of the matter was that I had hacked damn near every day for over a year, and I really needed a break. I wanted to know what it felt like to work a normal 8-hour job and reap the benefits of not having to do everything myself. Not to mention health insurance when my body broke down. The very next correctional officer I picked up, I asked her where to go to apply for a correctional officer's position. She told me 301 East Preston Street. I was hesitant to go at first because of my past drug charges. Even though I had beaten all of them, I felt the white establishment would find a way to hold my past against me. Finally, I said, fuck it. I didn't have anything to lose. I took my chances and filled out an application. It took about 4 months for them. Goddamn, 4 months. It took about 4 months for them to call me in for an aptitude test. A month after that, I was called in to take a physical. I began to feel good about my chances, especially since I received a letter to report to Jessup, Maryland to take a psychological test the next month. My regulars started finding other means of transportation once I informed them of my endeavors. I didn't want to let them know at the last minute so they wouldn't be scrambling for a way to get to work. In the meantime, I had to hit the streets. I wasn't picking up anybody who looked suspicious. If a motherfucker's pants was hanging off his ass, I zoomed right by him. If a woman didn't have at least 2 children with her, she was out of luck. I didn't give a fuck about right or wrong. I wasn't playing no games. You can call it reverse discrimination if you want. I stereotyped the shit out of anybody that didn't look right. The following month, I drove to Jessup for a psychological test and appeared to do well. I couldn't believe I was on my way to becoming a CO. This shit was crazy. It was hard for me to grasp the idea of being in law enforcement. I had grown up on the flip side of the coin, where you survived by any means necessary. I tripped my ass off all the way back to Baltimore. Every day, I looked in the mailbox for that "you are hired" letter, only to be disappointed. Doubt started to set in. I figured that they found out about my drug past and tossed my application into the trash can. To make things worse, I was starting to have car problems. Christmas was around the corner, so I just focused on keeping the car on the road so I could get my children's presents. Every other day, it would break down on me, but I would manage to get it fixed. I was determined to get as much as I could out of it before the engine died. As always, God heard my prayers, because the old Chevy held up until I was able to make enough money for my children's gifts and knock out a few bills. I knew that the engine wouldn't last long. I would figure out a plan B when it got to that point. I was too busy praying for plan A to continue to be useful. If corrections didn't come through, most likely I would have gone back to renting cars. As fate would have it, on December 24th, 1993, the overheating of my car would put an early end to my day. The day before Christmas was one of the busiest days for hacking. I was on my way to making a killing. Instead, I barely made it back to my apartment. I was frustrated as ever. In a way, I was glad to be home because I was suffering from that dreadful trilogy: cold, tired, and hungry. I headed up the steps to my apartment feeling really down. I had the holiday blues and just wanted to throw myself into the bed. Instinctively, I checked the mailbox, hoping for a miracle. I looked through the junk mail and saw a letter that was from the Departments of Corrections. My heart started beating fast. Could this be the letter I was waiting for? I sat on the steps and held the letter for a few minutes. I was afraid of being disappointed. What if it read, "I'm sorry, we're not hiring at this time"? After a few excruciating moments, I mustered up the courage to open the letter to confront my fate. The letter had instructed me to report to the Jail Industries building on January 12, 1994 at 8 a.m. for orientation. Immediately, my knees united with the floor as I poured my heart out to God, thanking Him for delivering me once again. Chapter 4, 1994. Commissioner Lamont W. Flanagan, Warden Bernard Smith. Oh, so I guess that's the commissioner and the warden at the time of the jail. The morning of January 12, 1994, I was soaking in the tub, relaxing, listening to my radio on what I thought was the final day before I was to start my new job. The sky was filled with huge dark clouds that released a heavy flow of rain that added to my laid-back mood. I was contemplating whether I wanted to go hacking one last time or chill out at the movies. Contemplating hacking was more instinctive than an actual desire. I've been doing it routinely for so long, it had become a second nature. But soon, this hustle would be behind me. There would be no more stress of hustling up money to meet financial deadlines at the last minute. I would be making some good guaranteed money. I came to the conclusion the movies was more fitting for a rainy, dreary day. As I laid there, engulfed in a feeling of calm that had eluded me for years, I heard something over the radio that shattered my peace. My heart started racing 100 miles an hour like the time that policeman pointed a gun at my head. We're going to have a steady rainfall all day on this cold 12th day of January. The DJ announced to his listeners. I felt like I was about to hyperventilate. I know goddamn well that man didn't say the 12th of January. The day is the fucking 11th. What the hell is he talking about? I shouted. I panicked and dialed 411. All I knew was that I needed information. The woman on the other end repeated the same bullshit as the DJ. I was so desperate to hear that it was the 11th of January that I dialed the operator. To my disbelief, she said the same as the others. I jumped out of the bathtub and ran through the house butt-ass naked looking for something to put on. I kept shouting, I thought it was the 11th, as if that was going to change shit. The car was not running good, so I called a cab. The cab was taking all day, so I took my chances with the car. headed towards 531 East Madison Street in the pouring rain. I was hoping like hell I wasn't turned away for being late my first day. When I arrived, it was almost noon. The orientation had started at 8 a.m. I couldn't believe I fucked up like that. I knew damn well how much I needed this job. When I got to the building, I had to walk up a lot of steps before I got to the entrance. At the desk was a dark complexion, medium-sized man whose name tag read OFC Umoja. I was familiar with the name. It was the same as the first principle of Kwanzaa, which means unity in Swahili. The man didn't appear to be the friendliest person in the world, which made me more nervous than I already was. His uniform was impressively sharp. Shoes shined and his hat sat perfectly on his head. You could see this man was serious about his job. "How may I help you today, sir?" he asked in a confident, almost arrogant manner. I told him I was reporting for orientation. Why did I tell him that? He looked at his watch and shook his head as if I was the bubble gum on the bottom of his boot. I knew he was about to come out his mouth real slick, so I mentally prepared myself. "Sir, orientation started at 8 a.m. It's 12 p.m. right now," he stated. I said to myself, please, God, don't let Officer of the Decade turn me away. I could tell he wasn't for any nonsense. He reminded me of one of my drill sergeants. After a few tense seconds of not knowing what he was going to do, he finally asked me for my identification. After he thoroughly searched me, he directed me to where orientation was being held. I hurried up and got the hell away from Officer Umoja in case he changed his mind and put me out. An officer that was in a small office that operated the electronic doors opened the door that led towards the lounge where orientation was being held. The lounge was already full when I entered. Officer D. Clayton, the orientation instructor, asked me who I was. I told her my name and apologized for being late. She strolled down the clipboard at the list of people scheduled for orientation and confirmed that I was supposed to be there. In spite of my gross lateness, Officer D. Clayton's demeanor was far more welcoming than that of Officer Umoja. Her warm smile made me feel at ease. She asked me to introduce myself to the group and tell them what brought me into the field of corrections. I told them my name and stated, "I'm here to get out of the rain." They thought I was literally talking about the rain outside, but I was talking about the rain of adversity that was pouring in my life. As I was talking to my new classmates, a tall man with glasses, broad shoulders, and a salt and pepper beard walked through the door. Like Umoja, his uniform was immaculate. He stood straight up with perfect posture as if he was proud of the uniform he was wearing. He spoke with an air of professionalism and authority. His words flowed smoothly, complimenting his easygoing demeanor. He introduced himself as Captain Barty, the head of the training department. Right off the bat, I liked his style. He appeared to be about his job, but not one of them punch drunk, you can't tell me nothing, I've been in corrections forever type of man. He informed us about the seriousness of training. He warned us that the Baltimore City Jail would be unlike any place that we've ever experienced. We all listened and giggled at the scared straight tactics he was trying to use. Little did we realize that this was not a game he was playing. We spent the first few weeks learning emergency codes and other jail rules and regulations. During those weeks, I got a chance to learn a lot about my classmates. Officer A. Foster was clean-cut and extremely ambitious. He would become my closest partner in the jail, especially during dangerous times. Then you had Officer Pearson, college boy from New York. While people were running away from Baltimore, he and his wife, Rosalind, decided to settle in Baltimore to raise their 2 daughters. I don't know what the hell they were thinking about. Officer Spencer was the pretty boy. His approach to the job was strictly business. Officer Ennals was the country boy from Salisbury, Maryland, who hit like a mule. Officer Lundy was a big man with muscles everywhere, but would be the first to tell you that he didn't want any trouble. Officer Davis was the motherly type, full of advice. Officer Sonia was the homegirl from around the way. She always wore a smile and was always up to something. Officer Tom was the only white classmate. He threw in the towel after a couple of weeks. Officer Thomas was extremely unapproachable. I used to call her the Antichrist. Officer Gibbs was the toast of the party. Everybody fucked with Officer Gibbs. Officer Satchel was the type of brother that had your back. My man, Officer Mack, may he rest in peace, was the silent one. He would unexpectedly explode if you took him there. Last and certainly not least, there was me. Let's just say I had some serious issues. We weren't scheduled to go to the academy for another 3 weeks. Captain Barty wanted us to get some on-the-job training while we were waiting. That way, we would have some experience working in the jail when we returned from the academy. He wanted us to tour the MDC, Men's Detention Center, first. MDC was also known as Steel Side because it consisted mostly of cells with iron bars. It was also known as the main jail because that was the original part of the jail that was built in 1859. Captain Barty and Officer D. Clayton had told us so many horror stories about the infamous MDC. We were anxious to see how true they were. On the day of our first tour of MDC, the cold, frigid wind greeted us as we exited the JIB building. Like a bunch of school students, we walked across Madison Street behind our two instructors until we came upon a huge steel roll-up door. Captain Barty and Officer D. Clayton stood there patiently waiting for the door to roll up like it was nothing. They were used to waiting for doors to open. We impatiently stood there and froze our ass off. No one dared complain. We tried to appear harder than what we were. Finally, the gate rolled up. A white officer from a tower called Post Number 6 greeted us as we walked beneath the roll-up gate. His name was Officer Bills. He controlled the electronic button to the roll-up gate. Inside the tower was the jail's armory, which stocked .38 caliber revolvers and Remington shotguns. The weapons were issued out to the transportation unit officers when they escorted inmates back and forth to court. They were also used for transporting inmates who had gotten violently assaulted to the hospital, as well as other special details that required a weapon. The first checkpoint we came to was post number 5. Clearly, the officer that worked this post was disgruntled. She was shivering from the cold and cussing up a storm, complaining about how cold it was. I thought Captain Barty was going to reprimand her like superiors did in the military when someone of the lower rank was out of order. But Captain Barty just stood there, cool as an icicle, and let her vent as if this was normal behavior. Once she saw that nobody was paying her any attention, her fat ass started getting slick out the mouth with us. She demanded to see our ID as if we were trying to break into the motherfucker. From the look in Sonia's eyes, I knew she wanted to cuss her out. Because we were new, we dealt with her nasty attitude. When it was time for her to frisk search us, she aggressively patted our coat pockets and slid her hand up the inside of our thighs until she dug all the way up our ass. I said to myself, I hope this nasty ass fucker stay out here and freeze to death. We walked across a huge parking lot where all the jail's transportation vehicles were parked. We approached another checkpoint. This post was called post number 10, and to no one's surprise, there was another pissed off officer who was uninterested in greeting us. Immediately, he started complaining to Captain Barty about how fucked up the timekeeper was for making him work out in the cold after he was drafted to work an additional 8 hours because of staff shortage. Captain Barty shrugged his shoulders and told the officer it was nothing he could do. He had to talk to the duty captain or the shift commander. That's bullshit, Barty, the officer responded as we walked through the fence doors down a long outside corridor that led to another key post called post number 11. Captain Barty never acknowledged the officer's rage. He ignored the shit out of him to the point that it was obvious that he didn't like the man. Once we arrived to post number 11, Captain Barty pointed to the two sections on the other side of the grill and told us they were the infamous sections K and J. He told us he was going to save those sections for last because they were about to go to the courtyard at the time. We went through a solid red steel door that led down a long hallway. As we went down the hallway, there were officers escorting new inmates into different offices to be processed. The other inmates waiting to be processed were locked into a huge bullpen across from the in-process and classification offices. At the end of this hallway, inmates were evaluated for suicidal and psychological conditions. Their medical conditions as well as their criminal history were assessed to determine where they were going to be housed according to their medical circumstances and security level. As we walked further down the hallway, all you heard was noise. It seemed like 1,000 people were talking at the same time. By the time we got to the end of the hallway, I'm sure it was damn near 1,000 people in that area. The shit looked like something in a prison movie gone wild. Inmates were packed in bullpens like slaves of the Middle Passage. Their arms were reaching through the bars like they were zombies grabbing for food. I said to myself, my God, what kind of shit is this? They were angrily screaming about the congested conditions in the bullpens and how hungry they were. Officers were walking around ordering inmates to go in certain directions. They were oblivious to the inmates' hostile pleas and threatened to do bodily harm to them if they didn't shut the fuck up. It looked like we were in the midst of an organized, chaotic structure of a human mess. It seemed like everybody was threatening to kill, stab, maim, and shoot everybody. This exchange of threats between officers and inmates appeared to be allowed to vent out frustration. In the midst of all of this frustration, I became the center of attention. We were the new kids on the block, the rookies that would give them amusement and temporary relief from their misery. Hey, look at the bald-headed skinny bitch with the glasses. Look at him, y'all. That dumbass got dress pants on with some slippery earls. That nigga ain't no CO. He a pimp. One of the inmates yelled from the bullpen. I looked at my classmate and said, I know he ain't talking about me. Everybody knew he was referring to me because I was the only one that fit the description. The supply unit didn't have any pants in my size. In the meanwhile, I had to wear a pair of my navy blue dress pants that I wore to church. Plus, I had to wear my black dress shoes because I didn't have enough money to buy some boots. The truth of the matter was that I was waiting for my next check to go to Howard Uniform so I could buy some uniform pants and a fresh pair of high-techs, the boots everybody was wearing during the time. From the giggles of my classmates and officers who were passing by, it was clear that the dusty motherfucker had scored a good one. Instinctively, without even realizing, I yelled back, "That's why your bitch ass is locked up." That statement struck a nerve with all the inmates. They felt like I was downgrading them because of their situation. I could care less about their situation. I was disrespected, so I returned the favor. The inmates started to go into an uproar, but Captain Barty calmed them down. I waited for him to pull me to the side and verbally counsel me, but he tossed that incident out of his head and continued the tour. This end of the hallway was known as post number 37, aka receiving. It was named receiving because it was the area where inmates were processed after being dropped off from the police districts throughout the city. They were piled inside a sally port, aka a holding area that resembled a bullpen. That was connected to a caged-in area that was transformed into an office. From slots between the sally port and the office called the cage, officers would collect any inmate's property that was prohibited inside of the jail, such as clothes that resembled uniforms, money, expensive jewelry, etc., were confiscated. Their property was put in plastic bags and sent to the property room, and their money was sealed in envelopes and sent to finance to be placed into their accounts. At any given time, 60 or more inmates would be stuffed into this small enclosed area. On one side of the sally port, there was a sliding steel door, and the other side was a grill. Both were opened and closed by electrical control. Once the first stage of an in-processing was complete, the inmates were taken to an old World War II-looking shower room and strip searched. It was just like in the movies. They got naked, faced the wall, squatted, and spread their ass cheeks, then coughed. To me, this appeared to be the most humiliating process, but to most of the men, it was routine. It was during this initial stage of an in-process that my classmates and I received our first lesson to what happens to an inmate who does not comply with the rules at the Baltimore City Jail. There were 2 officers inside of the cage. They were pretty much responsible for the operation of receiving. Officer Fields, the smaller of the 2, was the officer collecting the inmate's property. He reminded you of a football player with a chest that looked like a brick wall. His biceps were damn near the size of ripe watermelons. Though he had no nonsense written on his face, I must say the brother was very professional. He informed one inmate who was wearing a gold ring that the ring had to go into his property bag. It was unauthorized inside the jail. The inmate appeared to be agitated because of the crowded condition and shouted, "Fuck you, fat boy. I ain't giving you shit." I truly think he picked the wrong day to be agitated. If Officer Fields' chest looked like a brick wall, the other officer in the cage looked like an industrial factory. Everybody called him Baby James. To this day, whoever decided to attach baby to his name had to be clinically blind. This was a grown-ass man among boys. Unlike Officer Fields, he was not muscular, but massive. Officer James stepped out of the cage and walked to the grill of the sally port and told Officer Fields to open the grill. Captain Barty gathered us in one area as if he knew what was about to happen. When the grill opened, Baby James asked the man to step out of the sally port in a respectful, professional manner. Unalarmed by Baby James's calm demeanor, the inmate exited the sally port, cursing and screaming about not giving up his ring. Baby James patiently listened to the inmate as he escorted him into an empty bullpen. "I'ma ask you one more time for the ring, sir, or else I'ma take it from you," Baby James informed the inmate in a calm manner. "I'm not giving you shit. This is my property. What the fuck is it gonna hurt for me to keep my ring on?" The man lashed out, ignorant of the danger he was in. For some reason, the brother just didn't get it. It wasn't about what he wanted. He was pleading his case to somebody that didn't give a fuck about him or his desires. Before the massacre began, the entire area had become silent. You could have heard a shank drop. Like a grizzly, Baby James snatched the man by his collar and violently slammed his body against every wall, floor, and grill of the bullpen. It was the first time I've ever seen a person get the living shit beat out of them without a punch ever being thrown. After the man was embraced by a sudden burst of hostility, he lay suspended in thought on the cement floor, bleeding from his head. God damn. Oh my gosh. Baby James reached down and took the ring off his finger. He went and retrieved a bag lunch from a milk crate and threw it on top of the man's body, then went back to work. To my surprise, nobody protested the ass whipping. The inmates were more interested in when they were going to get their bag lunch. I looked towards Captain Barty to see what his response was going to be. He just shook his head and escorted us back to the other end of the hallway and out of the building, back toward post number 10. Near post number 10 was a building called the Annex. It was the next destination of our tour. As we walked in the cold toward the Annex, still tripping off what we had just witnessed, the most shocking part of the whole ordeal was how normal the brutal act of violence was. On the streets, Baby James's actions could have easily been interpreted as an attempted murder. Captain Barty left us at post number 10 and went back to the JI building. Officer D. Clayton took charge of the tour. The Annex was a 4-story brick building where the jail's working men were housed. From the outside, it looked like a small replica of a project building. On each floor, there was a section that consisted of dorms. After Officer D. Clayton explained to us the inmates' daily duties as well as their illegal side activities, she explained that the working men were primarily responsible for transporting most of the drugs and other contraband throughout the jail. As sanitation and dietary workers, they had almost unlimited access to all parts of the jail. As soon as you entered the building, there were dorms full of inmates. Shit looked real crazy. It reminded me of an abandoned army barracks. Wet clothes were hanging on strings that were tied to adjacent bunk beds. Inmates were sitting on steel tables in their boxers playing cards or looking at TV. The area was calm with no signs of trouble. You could sense that this area was a privileged area by the relaxed, almost joyful demeanor of the inmates. The section on the first floor was called post number 10A. The sections on the second, third, and fourth floors were called post 10B, 10C, and 10D. While the officer assigned to post number 10A was briefing us on the daily operations, a slim, dark-complexioned officer approached us. He was the dietary officer in charge of the working men, who worked in the kitchen. He was coming to get some of his working men. He appeared to be in his early 50s. For a skinny dude, he walked with a lot of confidence and expression on his face that signified he had some authority. He had a cunning laugh that seemed to have an ulterior motive behind it. It was clear that he was from the old school. He introduced himself to our class as Cornelius, and after saying a few words to Officer D. Clayton, he immediately started lecturing us about the do's and the don'ts of correction. The first thing y'all need to do is let these niggas know y'all not to be fucked with. Be yourself and be fair. Don't promise these motherfuckers nothing and don't lie to them. If you say you gonna do something, do it. If you can't or don't want to do something, don't be afraid to say no. Get used to saying no right now or these niggas will run you crazy. Without catching his breath, Officer Cornelius continued. If a motherfucker get in your face, you cut the living shit out of him. I don't care who the fuck they were on the streets. This is our house. I'm telling y'all right now, don't play with these niggas. This shit is not a joke. For a moment, it looked like the man had snapped. I didn't know if he was having an anger attack or got so caught up in his message that he was losing control. I thought this frail, fragile-looking man was going to give us advice about our uniforms or coming to work on time. Instead, he was on some kill or be killed shit. I thought this shit was just a job. According to Officer Cornelius, this was a way of life. Out of nowhere, he started looking at my classmate, Officer Spencer, in total disgust. I thought Spencer knew him from the streets or something, the way he was staring at him. Officer Spencer looked at him, trying to figure out what was wrong. What is your problem? Why you over there giggling, son? You think this shit is a joke? Officer Cornelius asked Spencer. We all looked at Officer Cornelius baffled. It seemed like the man was fucked up in the head. You know, one of them Vietnam veterans who saw too many dead bodies. Man, what are you talking about? I'm listening to you, Officer Spencer responded, trying to show the elderly some respect. Like a ferocious pit bull in a chihuahua's body, Officer Cornelius went off. See, it's new niggas like you they bring in here fucking the place up. Y'all walking around smiling and shit thinking everything is a goddamn joke. Officer Cornelius lashed out. Spencer tried to hold his tongue, but the ornery's veteran's nasty disposition made it impossible. Man, you better get the fuck out my face with that bullshit. You don't know me. I'm here trying to learn. I don't know what the fuck you talking about. Damn. Why did he say that? Officer Cornelius slowly walked towards Officer Spencer with a feisty glare in his eyes as he uttered, "Nigga, I'll cut your ass. Keep running your mouth." Officer D. Clayton knew back then the officers were known for carrying knives on them for protection. She held Officer Cornelius back and told us to exit the building. She had seen that things had gotten out of control. Instead of touring the rest of the building, she felt that we had experienced enough of the jail for one day. We went back into the JI building, mentally exhausted from the unexpected hostility that we had encountered, not from inmates, but from officers. The debate in Officer Tom's mind about whether he should give corrections a chance or not was over. He quit the same day. When I got home that night, I didn't know what to think. I was surprised at a lack of structure and professionalism, but I was not deterred. I also was a little set back by the abrupt violence that seemed so normal. The only reason I was able to sleep well that night was because I was so happy to have a decent job, or should I say, a job with decent pay. Before we started our on-the-job training in MDC, Officer D. Clayton gave us a tour of the entire JI building. The building itself was the old Baltimore Gas and Electric building. The city purchased it in the mid-1980s to house the overflow of inmates that came from the MDC, aka main jail. On the first floor of the building, there were administration offices, the supply room, inmates visiting area, the mailroom, officers lounge, and training classes. At the entrance of the building, there were two security posts, 200 and 200A. These posts monitored the traffic that came in and out of the building and searched people for contraband as they entered. On the second floor, there were sections 500, 600, and 700. Each of these dorms had a full capacity of 100 inmates. The dorms were sectioned off by steel grills dividing the dorm in half, in which each side's full capacity held 50 inmates. The gym, the JIB release area, the area where inmates were released from jail, the supervisor's office, and the captain's office were also on the second floor. The third floor consisted of two sections, 800 and 900. These two dorms were open dorms. They had no steel grills dividing the 100 inmates that were housed in these dorms. As the years went by, additional inmates would be stuffed into the dorms because of overcrowding. Eventually, 800 dorm would reach a full capacity of 136 inmates. It would become as dangerous for officers as it was for the inmates. 2 officers were assigned to each section. One officer sat inside an area that was called the bubble. It was actually an office with a large, thick glass window so the officer could monitor the inmates. Technically, the other officer assigned to the post was supposed to sit inside the dorm with the inmates to monitor their activities. This was a rule that was constantly violated. No officer wanted to sit in a dorm with 100 inmates in their face complaining about all manner of dumb shit. Not to mention, they were disrespectful and could be abruptly violent without warning. Hardly anybody complied with this rule. The 2 officers sat in the bubble, keeping each other's company, playing cards or whatever, while the inmates mutilated each other. For the most part, the JI building wasn't that bad at the time. Every now and then, an inmate would get hit in his head with a steel drawer that was connected to a steel footlocker at the bottom of the bunk they were assigned to, or got smashed in the head with a sock full of batteries while they slept. I don't know whose brilliant idea it was to put steel foot lockers with removable steel drawers in a jail dorm where violence was as natural as breathing. After touring the JIB, I think deep down, all of us was anxious to start training in the notorious MDC. That was where you really earned your stripes. It would let you know if you were cut out to be a so-called CO. At least I was hoping that Captain Barty didn't change his mind about letting us train in MDC before we went to the academy. This would also give us the opportunity to calm a lot of our fears. I was tired of thinking about how awful it was. I wanted to confront my fears and get it over with. Wondering if we were going to get the opportunity to train in MDC was short-lived because that's where we were the very next day. Captain Barty and Officer D. Clayton kept reiterating working in MDC was where you earned your respect and rose up the ladder. I wasn't too interested in rising up the ladder. Just having a good job was good enough for me. However, my mind was attracted to gaining respect in the worst part of the jail. First, Officer D. Clayton gave us a tour of all the sections in the MDC. MDC, aka the main jail, was divided into two buildings, North Building and South Building. The South Building wasn't as notorious as the North, but it was certainly the busiest. Unlike the JIB, inmates were housed in cells. C and D sections were right down the hall from receiving. They mainly housed inmates who had recently processed into jail. In fact, you could call C and D sections and receiving the in-processing area, with the exception of Section B, which was right across from receiving's cage. This section mainly housed miscellaneous inmates the jail was trying to hide or because other sections were too full to house them. Receiving itself was extremely busy. The halls were packed with inmates coming and going. We were kind of familiar with this area because this is where Baby James gave the inmate physical therapy. Each side had a row of cells on two tiers, with the exception of B section, which only had one tier on each side. In each cell, there were two inmates. The cells were about the size of my bathroom. Literally, there was enough room for a bunk bed, a steel toilet with a sink connected, and enough space where the inmates could do push-ups, play cards, and fight. The officers from the JIB were noticeably different from the MDC officers. The JIB officers were calm and easygoing. Their uniforms were neat, which reflected their professional demeanor. When it came to the patients, there was no contest between the two. The officers in MDC were very aggressive and didn't want anything to do with patients. They were focusing on hurry up and getting the day's activities over so they could lock the inmates in their cells. The frustration and hostility among the inmates were always at its boiling point. Unlike the inmates in the JIB who could walk free around the dorm and had access to various resources, the inmates housed in MDC had limited access to phones, TV, showers, recreation rooms, or simply able to walk around. Once they were in their cells, it was game over. Because of the violent climate of the jail, they didn't know when the next time they were coming out of their cells. It could be the next day or the next month. To work a section in MDC, it was mandatory to match the inmate's aggression. For most of the officers, it was a rite of passage to be able to run a section. If you had to bludgeon an inmate half to death to earn respect, so be it. This was the nature of the MDC officer. All you heard all day was shit like, "I'm telling you, my man, you better lock the fuck in. I'm not gonna tell your ass no more." If the inmate wasn't in compliance after you gave him a final warning, you sized him up and then whooped his ass. If he looked like one of them hard-hitting motherfuckers, you would call a code 2. Officer needs assistance over the radio. Back then, it took about 15 seconds before a sea of officers in white shirts would flood the tiers with devastating effects. They would come swinging and kicking like wild feasting dogs. No matter how big the inmate was or what kind of weapon he had, all he could do was ball up in a knot and take that ass whooping. When I first witnessed the code 2, I thought the officers were literally going to kill the inmate. I mean, it looked like some shit off the National Geographic. You know the way the pack of wolves ripped apart the deer until he was lifeless? Officers were jumping over each other trying to get the inmate who was already unconscious. The shit damn near brought tears to my eyes, but I dare not show any emotions for the inmate. The zombies might have turned on me. Training in MDC was some serious shit. You could feel the intensity in the air. You could see the adrenaline rush in the officers' faces. You were suspicious of every inmate you saw. All of them were perceived as guilty of something. Captain Barty was right. This was not something you could learn in a textbook or from an instructor. You had to experience this madness firsthand to understand the brutal and sensitive culture of the jail. Finally, I got around to the infamous J and K sections. As advertised, they were the most intimidating. I had wanted to embrace the challenge of working on the jail's worst sections, and I got what I desired. I would train on J section one day and K the other. The inmates didn't complain a lot, but you could tell there was a lot of tension in the air. I would watch them as they made deals for cigarettes, food, clothes, tennis shoes, haircuts. Inmates even negotiated deals to wash other inmates' clothes. These inmates were called Maytag. They were named after the company that make washing machines. During my short time training on J and K sections, a few people got stabbed, but not on a 911 level. They basically walked around with black eyes, staples in their head, heavy limps, stitches across their face, and a host of other combat wounds. Nobody ever complained. They just went on about their daily business as if nothing ever happened. When I would ask one of them what happened, their most popular answers were, "I fell off the bunk," or "I slipped in the shower." The officer who was training me told me that most of the injuries came from not paying some kind of debt. Inmates would get cigarettes, commissary, and drugs on credit, knowing damn well they did not have the money to pay off the credit. Of course, there was always that one, or maybe 2 or 3 that would try you. In my case, it seemed like the whole fucking section. I expected as much because I was a rookie. Plus, I was without a complete uniform on. The only things that confirmed that I was a correctional officer was my white shirt and badge. My dress pants made me look like I sang on Maryland's men choir, and my slippery earls made me look like I tap danced for a living. The inmates had no mercy. They joked the shit out of me. It was nothing I could say. I was out of order. During the end of the day, when I had to make a body count, it was like a comedy show. Shit was so funny, the officer who was training me started laughing at their jokes. In fact, I even started laughing at my damn self. I went along with the flow because if I was them, I would have done the same. Then you had those few who went overboard. Everybody was satisfied with just teasing me, but you had the assholes who yelled out degrading remarks such as, "You dumbass whore, you ain't no fucking CO. Yo, that bald head bitch is a fake ass CO." I may have been a rookie, but I was still a man. Joking was one thing, but disrespect was another. All that derogatory shit that was spewing out of their mouths was right up my alley. They weren't the only ones that had unresolved grief and tension inside of them. I had some pent-up emotions that I needed to get out of my motherfucking system also. "I got your whore, you bitches. If that's how you feel, say that shit to my face. I'll slip one of these slippery earls right up your bitch ass," I lashed out. My training officers would put the inmates in check when things started getting out of order. Nevertheless, after defending my manhood, I felt good about myself. Where I came from, a man stood his ground regardless of the consequences. I could have cared less if these men were locked up. My theory was that the confined bleed just as much as the free. After that one incident, word had gotten around the jail about the tough bald-headed CO with the glasses. A couple of days later, when MSC, mass security conditions, was called, I had to make my last body count before it was time to go home. While making my count, an inmate shouted from his cell, "Yo, that's the bald head motherfucker that think he's Lieutenant Watkins. Yeah, that bitch ass nigga can get it too," another inmate yelled in response. I knew exactly who they were referring to. This wasn't the first time I heard Lieutenant Watkins' name. When I toured the jail with my classmates, we heard the inmates tell epic stories about how awesome this lieutenant was. They talked about how he used to walk on sections, growling out orders in a deep, husky voice. If an inmate didn't comply with his commands, he would bang him in the face without hesitation. He would take off his uniform shirt and challenge inmates to a gladiator summit in the day room. At first, I thought these stories were full of hype, especially when they said the man was in his mid-40s and small in stature. Then I began to hear the same stories told by officers and supervisors. I told myself that I needed to meet this man. The Baltimore City Jail was a pretty intimidating place. You weren't dealing with any slouches. All these inmates did all day were eat loaves of bread, do push-ups, pull-ups, and lift weights when they were in the courtyard. Yet, as hardened criminals, they respected, even revered this man. I asked Officer D. Clayton if she could introduce me to him. She told me she would because she thought he would like my toughness. She had heard about how I stood my ground on the sections around the jail. Unfortunately, the first and last time I would meet this fearless warrior was when he was lying in a casket due to a lethal ambush that occurred in front of his house on January 29, 1994. I humbly stood over the horizontal body of a warrior who I would never formally get a chance to meet. I thought about how much I could have learned from him. Watching Lieutenant Watkins rest so peacefully, I tried to imagine the fierce viciousness that engulfed such an average-sized man. Most of the stories I heard about him, I wondered how many were real and how many were exaggerated. The one thing I can say, they were all consistent, whether inmates were telling them or officers. The legacy he left behind before entering his grave was undeniable. I would have loved to work with him. For a man who was bigger than life at the jail, I expected him to be put away in a grand, extravagant environment with hundreds of people lined up to view his body. However, this was not the case. His corpse laid on display at Joseph G. Locke's Jr. Funeral Home, a small, modest funeral home on North Central Avenue in East Baltimore. When I went to view his body, there were no mourners. In fact, I didn't notice any flowers. There was no evidence that suggested that this great man was what people said he was. It was only emptiness and silence. According to the newspaper, Lieutenant Watkins was shot to death as he was walking towards his front door. He was ambushed by 2 unknown assailants. The story was going around in the jail that he was dating an officer from Jamaica and her husband had found out about it and had him killed. Some people were saying it was a drug deal gone bad. There were all kinds of speculations. If Lieutenant Watkins was well loved for his tenacious fighting ability, he must have had a lot of enemies for all the asses he kicked. I'm sure there were hundreds of suspects. To this day, no culprits were ever caught. When the inmate said, "You can get it too," I wasn't worried about my safety. I was angry because he was making mockery of the death of a fallen warrior. I assured whoever made that statement that I was going to find out who it was and fuck him up when I got back from the academy. I really meant that shit. Even though I was not officially a correctional officer, I felt some kind of loyalty to this man and the uniform. During my training, I crossed paths of some crazy-ass officers who I'm sure were a lot like Lieutenant Watkins. When I responded to a code 1016 or code 2, it was like running to an all-out bar fight. Both male and female officers used their radios, handcuffs, keys, broomsticks, boots, and of course fists as weapons. In the beginning, I didn't know what I was supposed to do, so I just did what everybody else did and started swinging on inmates. I didn't even care why we were fighting. I was just happy to be a part of the mayhem. I was getting used to this jail shit, and so were my classmates. As soon as we were getting acclimated to the jail, it was time to go to the academy. After being in a jail environment, the academy was a big letdown. The classroom environment was never my forte, but in order to keep my job, I knew I had to suffer through the boring instructors and the bullshit paperwork. A bus was provided by the jail for the officers who did not have a vehicle. By now, my engine had gone up, so I had to take the bus. In fact, I became the designated driver. Officer Mack was my co-pilot on what was called a bus. I thought that we were going to be riding in style, compliments of the state. Instead, the bus looked like it was bought from a yard sale. The steering wheel was so loose you had to rotate it in a complete circle to make a turn. Every time I drove past 25 miles an hour, the bus shook like a junkie. I was starting to understand what kind of organization I was dealing with. We were supposed to achieve maximum success with minimum results. Most of the time, Officer Mack, Officer Davis, Officer Gibbs, and myself were the only ones who rode the bus. When our other classmates didn't feel like driving or just wanted to save some gas, they rode with us. We had a ball driving to Woodstock, Maryland every day. We ate, listened to music, and cracked jokes all the way to and from the academy. There were officers from all over the state of Maryland representing their institutions at the academy. For reasons beyond my imagination, I was elected class president. I should have been elected class clown because I fucked with everybody all day long. In spite of the tremendous pressure not to fail tests or get dermatitis, I was a pure asshole. Looking back, I think I acted so crazy to conceal my fear of not passing the academy. My greatest motivation was because I seriously understood how being broke felt. The classroom setting was all business. No one wanted to be the one who got sent home. It wasn't that the work was hard, but the stakes were so high. Your livelihood was on the line. If you were late, you received a demerit. If you fell asleep in that hot-ass classroom, you received a demerit. If you failed a test or failed to carry out some kind of instruction, you received a demerit. People weren't there trying to learn. They were trying not to get a demerit. Once lunchtime came, all demerits were on hold. It was our time to release the stress. Officers Foster, Spencer, Pearson, Gibbs, Satchel, and I used to joke the shit out of everybody that came into the break area. As broke as I was, I had the nerve to crack on people's shoes, outdated pants, and anything I could get a laugh off of. Before long, all the officers were joking and feeling at ease. We had created a relaxed atmosphere. So in the end, being assholes actually served a good purpose. Officer Pearson, Officer Foster, and I developed a close bond. Officer Pearson and I were the oldest, so we had a lot in common. I became close with Officer Foster because both of us were gung-ho and determined to make our mark in the jail. As for the rest of my classmates, we really liked each other. We would all remain friends until death, termination, quitting, or retirement separated us. Like the day I was driving to the academy when I noticed Officer Mack was eerily quiet. We were the only two on the bus that day, so his quietness stood out. He was never one for many words, but this particular day, his shit was really on mute. While driving, I saw him from my peripheral vision staring at me. When I would glance at him, he would turn his head straight forward. Even when I tried to strike up a conversation, he would remain silent. I drove to the Royal Farm so we could get breakfast like I always did before we arrived at the academy. I turned toward Officer Mack and asked him if he wanted anything. He had a blank, menacing expression on his face. He stared at me as if he had ill intentions on his mind. I was startled. I never saw this look on his face before. He was far from the passive, pleasant Mac that I was accustomed to. "What's up, Mac? Is everything okay?" I asked. "Nah, everything ain't okay. I'm tired of your shit," he stated in a deep, unfamiliar tone. "You gonna stop fucking with me? I don't know who the fuck you think I am, but I ain't no fucking toy." Instantly, I had succumbed to shock. Through his thick glasses, his bloodshot eyes had expanded. For the first time, I noticed how big he was and how small I was. I guess danger has a way of bringing out such details. There was nothing to be said. The message was crystal clear. That was the last time Officer Mack or his glasses were the butt of my jokes. In fact, it took a while before I cracked another joke. The guys would ask me what was wrong with me, and I would just say I had something on my mind. Little did they know it was Officer Mack. Surprisingly, time had passed by so fast at the academy, it was getting close to crunch time. Graduation was right around the corner, and the instructors were giving out demerits like crazy. They didn't need any chairs in the classroom because everybody was standing up in fear of getting caught falling asleep. I was knocking tests out left and right. I could see the finish line. The instructors were even telling me to start preparing my speech for graduation day. All I could think about was earning a secure paycheck. After I passed a few more tests, it would be over. It would be the first time since I graduated junior high school that I walked across the stage. There was no ceremony when I received my GED. Then, like everything else in my life, disaster came knocking. As forecasted, it was cold and snowy one morning. I took my time driving to the academy. I wasn't trying to get into any accident so that they could make me pay for a bus that should have been put out of service in the first place. Everybody on the bus was asleep with the exception of Officer Matt. I was glad he was back to himself. The demon that possessed him had moved on. The further I drove away from the city, the deeper the snow became. As I started driving down the narrow road toward the academy, the bus started shaking more than normal. When I approached a curve in the road, I made a left, but the bus took a right. "Oh shit!" I cried out in vain as the bus slowly rolled down the hill, extremely eager to embrace the tree that was in its path. Graduation day flashed before me as I heard the other officers screaming in the background after being snatched from a deep sleep. I stayed calm as I looked disaster in the face. I was determined that this raggedy-ass bus was not going to spoil my life. I told myself if this piece of shit hit this tree, it would be my first and last demerit. After they released me from the hospital, Captain Barty could have rolled me into Warden Smith's office in a wheelchair and he still would have fired my ass. By the grace of Almighty God, I managed to turn the steering wheel completely around in a circle about 8 times and the bus swirled, avoiding hitting the tree. I managed to get the bus back onto the road and made it to the academy on time, saving everybody a demerit and some broken bones. One thing I can say, we all looked out for each other. If anyone had a problem with an upcoming test, we all pitched in to help them. Even though we tried our best to make sure everybody passed, there were many officers that did not make it. I'm proud to say every officer from the Baltimore City Jail, aka BCDC, made it through the academy. We may have been considered the bottom of the totem in the Maryland corrections, but we all came together and left together. As class president, I prepared my graduation speech with unity in mind because it was unity that got us all through. By the time I finished with the speech, people in the audience thought I was a member of the Nation of Islam. I talked about how fucked up the world was and how we needed to focus on not only being good officers, but decent citizens. Everybody was so proud of our accomplishment. We were on a mission to go back to our institutions to be beacons of hope for other officers who had given up on the system and positive role models to inmates who were trying to get out of the system. With teamwork, we were going to change the world. Unfortunately, all of our enthusiasm wasn't about to change a system of warehousing humans that was systematically established long before we were born. We were going back to a world of concrete, steel, and where unity had no meaning, and teamwork was only applied when it benefited the individual who practiced it. With our pretty beige-colored certificates, with the fancy gold lettering that confirmed that we were certified correctional officers, we went back to our institutions with the hope of changing the hopeless. The truth of the matter was that it was no way the academy even came close to preparing us for the miserable, horrific conditions that would confront us on a daily basis. When we got back to the jail, we were split up in different parts of the jail. Foster, Pearson, and myself were assigned to MDC. Matt, Gibbs, and Lundy were assigned to the JIB, and Satchel, Spencer, Davis, and Barnes were assigned to WDC. Enos was a former correctional officer, so he didn't have to go to the academy. He was already assigned to MDC. Officer Thomas had injured himself before we went to the academy, so she ended up doing office work until she was rescheduled to go to the academy at a later date. Before I reported to MDC, I was assigned to WDC for training. I didn't get the opportunity to train there before I went to the academy. At the time, there were men housed in dorms on the 4th and 5th floors. Inside WDC, there were 5 floors of dorms. The only cells in the building were reserved for lockup, receiving, protective custody, and the juveniles. Even in the heart of winter, it was hot as shit inside of this fortress that was built like a maze. The women were housed on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floors. If you didn't know your way around the building, you would certainly get lost. One day, I was going to the break room that was on the 2nd floor and ended up on the roof where the gym was. I was sent to Lieutenant Dorsey to receive my training. She was like the big sister type who always gave you advice. Before she even started talking to me about the jail, she started talking about the do's and don'ts of life. With her, it was all about moral responsibility. One of her main topics was how people should treat people the way they wanted to be treated. One of her last topics she covered was how I should not allow myself to be influenced by bad officers. She was a little too late with that lecture. My mind was already tainted. Lieutenant Dorsey didn't have time to show me around the building because she was the building commander. She had to stay in the office and do paperwork and monitor the phones. She gave Sergeant Luckett the task of showing me the ropes. Right off the bat, Sergeant Luckett was intimidating. She had this look about her that put you on notice that she wasn't for any games. Being a military man, I immediately observed her uniform to see if it coincided with her stern professional approach. Clearly, it passed with flying colors. I was nervous when she escorted me into the supervisor's office to talk jail protocol. Before she started talking about the jail, she complimented me on my professional appearance. I was surprised. It was the first time I had literally heard a compliment of any kind in years. Then she began to lay down the law of corrections. Officer Johnson, if you respect yourself and others, for the most part, you will gain respect. Don't switch up on the inmates. Be the same at all times so they know how to take you. The way you come to work is how they are going to perceive you. If you're sharp and professional, that's how they're going to carry you. If you come in the door playing and trying to be slick, they're going to eat you alive. First impressions are everything, and word travels quickly. Just come to work and do your job. If you have any problems, call a supervisor. That's what we're here for. Sergeant Luckett explained in detail. She asked me if I had any questions, in which I shook my head indicating no. She looked me in my eyes as if she was reading my internal thoughts, then she continued. If you come to work on time every day, stay away from gossip, keep inmates out your face, and respect rank, one day you'll retire with a pension. I was truly impressed. This is what I needed, some guidance. Sergeant Luckett showed me that it was possible to maintain your dignity in the midst of the undignified. I believe it was this conversation that gave me a sense of direction and understanding of my purpose of being at the jail, besides making money. Prior to our conversation, I didn't think anybody had a stable mind. Sergeant Luckett was my first role model at the jail. Her message was sincerely genuine. Her words were not for show. She really cared about her job and fellow officers. Her passion for keeping it real was what won me over. After Sergeant Luckett gave me a tour of the building, explaining the functions of each section, she introduced me to Officer Royster. He worked on the 4th floor with the male inmates. She informed me that I would be training with him the next couple of days because he was one of her top officers. Officer Royster was my kind of guy. He was the laid-back, diplomatic type. He didn't size me up like the other officers who viewed me as a threat to their whatever. He greeted me with respect, whether I was new or not. That's how true men treat men. He struck me as the type that could handle himself, but was more interested in keeping the peace. You could tell how much an officer had control of his section by seeing how the inmates treated him. The entire time that I spent with Officer Royster, not one inmate, officer, or supervisor disrespected him. He was likable, and it seemed like everybody got along with him. Before he gave me any words of instruction, he taught me the section's paperwork and, more importantly, made sure I knew the codes. Every now and then, our conversation would venture off to the subject outside of the job. We would talk about what part of town we grew up in and what clubs we frequented. I wasn't much of a partying type, but it was clear that Officer Royster enjoyed the nightlife. Once we concluded conversing about our social lives, We walked into the dorm so that I could see how the inmates lived and got a basic feel for the environment. There were also some rooms on the opposite side of the dorms that were occupied by inmates. He showed me them as well. They looked like small rooms that were converted into cells. While we were making the security rounds, I noticed that whatever the inmates needed as far as supplies, sick call slips, or anything dealing with their living conditions, Officer Royster accommodated them. As far as he saw it, when you gave the inmates what they're supposed to have, it made your job a lot easier. After all of the sightseeing, Officer Royster set me down and school had begun. Officer Johnson, if you don't remember anything else in corrections, remember that the number one thing is to make sure you and your co-workers go home alive. Secondly, make sure these inmates respect you. Treat them like human beings, but don't take no shit off them. Most of these guys want to do their time, go to court, and go home. The other fools, no matter how much you try to treat them like men with the utmost respect, they act like whores. When they take your kindness for weakness, give them what their hand calls for, Officer Royster lectured. I sat there and soaked it all in. While Officer Royster was talking, I noticed an inmate who was locked in one of the rooms staring at us through a small window. "What's up, my man? What's the problem?" I asked. "Oh, nothing, man. I'm just chilling." "Yeah, you listen to my man Royster. He telling you some good shit," the man said as he smiled, revealing a missing front tooth. Officer Royster put the lecture on hold and went to the restroom. While sitting at the desk waiting for him to return, I noticed some words that were written on the desk. They read, "A weak man died 1,000 deaths. A strong man only dies one." I interpreted it to mean that a weak person avoided their challenges and allowed their sufferings to linger. A strong person confronted their challenges right away, willing to suffer the consequences and get it over with. This adage would stay with me my entire career. I would let nothing slide. If an inmate, officer, or supervisor mistreated me, time stopped right then and there until the shit was resolved. The only time I would let shit linger was if I was plotting my revenge. The next day, Officer Royster had surprised me by giving me the keys, handcuffs, and radio and told me I was running the section on my own. I was scared as I don't know what. The only comfort that I would have was that he would be there to monitor me. He knew that I was nervous, but this was his way of letting me break the ice. First thing I was supposed to do was check the equipment and check the paperwork to see what the count was and who was off the section for whatever reason. Then I had to go and make a physical body count, confirming the information on the paperwork was right. All of this sounded simple. What was so hard about going into a dorm and counting bodies? Officer Royster warned me that the men had just finished breakfast, so all of them might not be on their bunks. He told me to go into the dorm with a firm tone and order every man to go to their bunk. I was excited and extremely nervous. "All right, everybody, get on your bunk. Come on, let's go," I yelled at the top of my lungs. I think I startled the hell out of everybody. It was around 7:10 a.m. Most of the men were still asleep. Inmates were groggily walking in and out of the bathroom, looking at me like I was crazy. I was expecting everybody to stop what they were doing right then and there. Stop eating, shitting, showering, brushing their teeth, or whatever. At the command of my voice, I expected these grown-ass men to run to their bunks. The inmates who were still in bed slowly rose from under their sheets like mummies to find out who was the fool making all of that noise early in the morning. I started getting frustrated when the inmates took their sweet old time slowly walking back to their bunks. Some ignored me altogether. I was even more pissed when somebody yelled, "Man, go put a dick in your mouth and shut all that fucking noise up." "Who the fuck said that?" I yelled as I searched the dimly lit dorm room for the culprit. Nobody stepped up to the plate, so I ran around the dorm like a drill sergeant demanding that everybody get on their motherfucking bunks or else. The inmates looked at me as if I was playing some kind of game. They were pissed off, but confused at the same time. Finally, one by one, they slowly started going to their bunks, shaking their heads and cussing. They started hollering for Officer Royster to come in the dorm and get me the fuck out of there. Officer Royster made a brief cameo and informed them that if anything happened to me, somebody was going to the hospital. On that note, the dorm became silent. I made my body count. I didn't know what at the time, but I knew I did something wrong. When I left the dorm, the inmates were still mumbling obscenities. I was eager to get Officer Royster's opinion on how I did. The look on his face let me know that I had a lot of learning to do. Without hurting my feelings, Officer Royster skillfully explained to me what I had done wrong. He informed me that the inmates didn't have any problems listening to me. They understood they were in jail and body counts were part of the protocol. But as with anything in life, The way you address people will determine how they're going to address you back. To put it bluntly, it was social etiquette 101. When you're dealing with inmates, Officer Johnson, you must look at the human factor. When you give somebody an order, you have to consider the conditions also. By the inmates still being half asleep, their bodies respond a little slower. You have to give them a little time. Don't worry, they're going to do what you tell them, he assured me. I felt like a dummy. I appreciated the way Officer Royster articulated my stupidity. I realized how much training I really needed. Working in the fast pace of MDC before I went to the academy didn't afford me the opportunity to learn public relations skills. Everything in MDC was kick ass and take names. Compromise was considered a sin. For the most part, inmates don't want no trouble. It's very rare that an inmate would approach an officer with some dumb shit. Something got to be wrong with him mentally, or he's scared to be on this section. In that case, when he jumped out there like that, you don't have a choice but to send him to shock trauma. But something really and truly got to be wrong with him to put his hands on an officer, Officer Royster expressed, revealing his sinister side. He displayed a cunning smirk as he pulled me to the side and proceeded with his off-record schooling. He looked around to make sure no inmates were within hearing distance before he presented the true underground Baltimore City Jail doctrine. Look, if an inmate run up on you threatening to do bodily harm, yo, don't panic. Be calm while the motherfucker gets his thing off. Don't argue back, because right now he has the advantage. He's around all his people. 9 times out of 10, if he carries it this far, he's planning on hitting you. Try to get him away from his boys, because they're going to pump him up. Your calmness is going to make him think you're a whore. But don't worry, it's all a part of the plan. The more he talked, the more I got into what he was saying. I couldn't wait for the punchline. I just knew he was going to come up with some kind of psychological tactic and talk the rage out of an irate inmate. Let the fool run his mouth. Normally, it takes officers about 15 seconds to come to your assistant. While he's running his mouth, whisper code 2 into the radio. Wait about 7 seconds, then hit this bitch with the radio with all you got. By the time he retaliates, officers will be there to massacre him. This is how we get down. Officer Royster proudly proclaimed as he shook the gigantic radio in the air as if he was imagining blood dripping from it. My God, I shouted within. No wonder these inmates respect him. I thought it was because of his quiet demeanor and public relations skills. He taught me a very poignant lesson. Never show the sword before the battle, but when you draw it, let everybody know its unmerciful power, and then you won't have to use it as often. This 1 week of training in WDC had laid down the foundation of how I would psychologically and tactically see things as an officer. Between Sergeant Luckett and Officer Royster, I had learned more about the true face of corrections than the academy could have ever taught me. All right, y'all, so it's been about an hour and a half. I'm still on chapter 4. It looks like I'm about a little past halfway. So I'm just going to stop right here. And then when I return, we'll pick up where we left off with the middle of chapter 4, which is 1994. And then we'll go ahead and continue with chapter 5, which will be 1995. So thanks for listening. I'll see you guys next video. And yeah, stay out of jail.